Go. Hey, everyone. My name is Steve Davis. I'm the AVP of Transportation Strategy for Smart Growth America. Thank you, everyone, for being here today for something very exciting for us. We've been working on for, I don't know, almost a year, it feels like. But this is the Best Complete Streets Policies 2023. We're really excited for you to be here. We're going to walk through this report today. First, I just want to say a quick word about Smart Growth America. Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit that empowers communities through technical assistance, advocacy, thought leadership to create livable places, healthy people, share prosperity. And you can see there on the screen, the National Complete Streets Coalition is one of SGA's programs. And the coalition furthers the development and implementation of complete streets policies and practices. So today, what is this report? The Best Complete Streets Policies Report 2023. This report evaluates all complete streets policies passed since the last report we did in early 2019. It's been a few years. We usually do this every year. This report recognizes the strongest policies, and this year we spotlight 4 specific stories of places that passed policies to explain how they did it and hopefully inspire a lot of you to do the same thing. A quick word about what complete streets are. This may be a new concept to some of you. And we have a definition here on the screen, but I just want to say complete streets represents a process in how we approach street design, building, designing, operating, maintaining our streets. It's not a single product. It's not a single type of street. And in some ways, streets are never truly complete. They're always growing, changing, transforming. Completion is not an endpoint. This is really more about an aspiration to always be improving and iterating our streets so that they better serve the needs of everyone who needs to use them, which, as our cities and communities always are, they're always changing. That's the heart of the approach and the process that we call complete streets. So it's a process. It's not a product. The other thing we want to say is that a policy, we're here to celebrate these policies today. You know, these policies are not silver bullets. They do not magically fix everything, but they are an incredibly vital first step in a much longer, more complicated process to shape the practices on street design. Quick word about the history of this report. So the Complete Streets Coalition has been around for almost 2 decades now, and over that time, more than 1,700 complete streets policies have been passed across the country. But the truth is that not all these policies are created equally. They vary widely in quality, and to help sift through those policies, the coalition has been evaluating and scoring policies for about the last 10 or 11 years. We started our first report in 2012. You can see them all there on the screen. I'll explain how we score the policies in just a moment. But, you know, why does this report matter? Why do we do this report every so often? Complete Streets represents a paradigm shift in street design. And, you know, why do we need a shift in our practice? Because you know, the status quo, the way we do things is unacceptable. It is not working. It's not working for anyone. And this report helps us find and spotlight the places that are truly committed to that kind of paradigm shift. The places in this top 10, top 20, these are the places that are really committed to doing this. Having that policy is one part of it, but we want to celebrate those places that are committed, because we are in the midst of an astonishing crisis of safety on our streets and our roads. If you've read our Dangerous by Design report, you know these numbers. 64% increase in people struck and killed while walking since 2011. This is an astonishing increase. And this crisis is not felt equally. These deaths are disproportionately people of color and people in low-income communities. You know, people talk about perhaps the extra costs of building safer streets, as if the cost of doing nothing isn't exorbitant. Every one of those numbers, every one of those 7,300 deaths in 2021, that represents somebody's loved one, a community member, a trauma that touches a wide circle of people. And that's unacceptable. We need to do better. These policies are one way that we start to move the needle in the right direction. Some communities are trying to do better. And they're writing these strong policies to help guide how they design and build their streets. And that's what we're here to celebrate today. So we're super excited to have you here as we celebrate these top 10, all the communities, but especially these 4 that are going to be with us today. We'll say another word in a minute. But how do we determine the best policies? We use what we call the Complete Streets Policy Framework. If you've seen this on our website in the past, it was often known as the 10 elements of a complete streets policy. And that's because it contains 10 elements that allow us to assign a quantitative value to each aspect of the policy. So here's the first one: establishing a commitment and vision. This is where communities in a policy, they really describe what their aspirations are for their streets. What are they trying to do with their streets? What are they trying to do with their complete streets policy? There are 9 more elements. You can find all these on our website. I think we'll have the link in the chat as well. We're really excited about these brand new graphics, and Stantec helped us develop these as we sort of revised the framework slightly this year. And I should also add that after some soul searching back in 2018, well into this movement, we overhauled our framework, the way that we evaluate and score policies, and decided what goes into a good policy to really raise the bar on what makes a strong policy. So that required more binding language, accountability. It was no longer acceptable to write a policy that said communities may, mays turned into shalls, things that you have to do. And also a real focus on prioritizing underinvested and underserved communities. So in this report, a couple trends that we wanted to highlight, just real high level. What sort of things did we see in this report? So this report looked at, we evaluated 157 policies that were passed between 2019 and 2022. We have sort of a bigger batch of policies that we evaluated because it's been a few years since we were able to do this report. In addition, we scooped up another, I think 48 policies from 2018 that we missed in our last report. Maybe they came out right, or were approved right around the time that report was being put together. So we've scooped those up in there. And those are part of the total of, over 1,700 policies that have passed. So overall, what did we see? Overall, the policy scores are going up. That's good news. The average score we see for policies, unfortunately, it's still pretty low, where the middle is. It's going up, it's getting better. And one real positive here is the fact that, we changed the framework it's harder to get a good score now than it was in 2017, since we changed this framework. And communities are really responding. They're rising to the challenge. The average score for these policies is going up compared to 2018. But I think what we're really excited about is looking at the places that are really committed, that are doing a really good job and writing really strong policies. Those strongest policies are getting even stronger. An average score of 72 to an average score of 89 in this report for that top 10. That's a really, really encouraging change. Here's the top 10 this year. We're really excited to celebrate these 10 communities. This includes the first perfect score that I think the coalition has ever awarded a policy for Howard County, which we're going to hear about today. On the website, I just note that you can dive into this data. You can explore the scores of all 159 policies that were evaluated. And we included in the table, if you go to the report page in the chat, the tab for policy scores, we also include in that table the scores of the policies that were in our 2018 report. So basically all the policies that have been scored with our new policy framework are included there. So you can go search for your community, sort by state, sort by city, sort by individual policy score, and kind of see where things stack up. A couple other things on there. We also have a separate spreadsheet that has really detailed scores. It has all the sub scores for each element, so you can really kind of drill into your policy. It has reference to the ordinance or legislation numbers, so you can look it up and find it. And also on that page, you can download our tool to evaluate your policy. If you're drafting a policy in your community, you're trying to find out if you're really ticking the boxes. How is it going to score? Is it strong? Is it not? You can download that evaluation tool to score and evaluate your policy. So we're really excited about that. Couple quick housekeeping notes before we dig in today. Please send your questions in the Q&A. Just helps us track things just a little bit better and stay on top of your questions so we don't miss anything. We're going to try to get to as many as we can, but we're also hopefully going to be able to follow up with some questions and answers via email, blog post, that sort of thing. So yeah, questions there. We'll also have a recording of this after. We'll send it out. If you're not on our email list, go on the website and hop on there, and we'll make sure that that you see it. So today, what we're going to do, we're going to dive into the story from 4 specific communities that have very strong complete streets policies. They're in the top 10. And I want to say a quick word about each one of these policies as we introduce our panelists today that we're really excited to have with us. But we're going to start with Howard County, Maryland, which is a county level policy, which we don't see a lot of. And they're almost never in our top 10. So if you are here from a county, this is a role model for you to consider. It's a great example of a great process and also a great policy and a terrific street design manual. And Howard County really shows the value of spending the time to develop a strong policy and get buy-in from everyone involved. Their policy was in the works for a number of years, but by working on it for so long, they emerged with everybody on board and with a really great street design manual that has clear instructions to follow. Sharing with us from Howard County today, we'll have Jeff Riegner. He's the senior principal engineer at Kittleson Associates. He also happens to be the chair of our National Complete Streets Coalition. But today he is here because in Howard County, he served as a consultant who assisted with the development of both the policy and the design manual. So thank you, Jeff, for being here today. In Tucson, we had the privilege of seeing them up close, both during their policy development process. We were there in person for some of their meetings. And then afterwards, through a video we produced last year about their story. I think we can drop that in the chat as well. Tucson built a really broad and diverse movement that not only deeply engaged community members, it treated them as very valued participants in the planning process and as experts, a certain type of expert. Instead of dismissing, community members as non-experts because they're not planners, they're not engineers, it valued the expertise of the community. And by doing this, it made their policies stronger, but also more likely to pass. Tucson had one of the best plans for implementation, which is a new focus of the policy framework now. If you do not have a plan for implementation, you will not score well. And theirs is terrific, and it's shaping the projects that they're being chosen for funding, even as we speak. Today from Tucson, we've got Evren Sonmez, who's the Director of Strategic Policy and Practice at the Living Streets Alliance in Tucson. She's a local advocate who was a key part of the policy development there. She's terrific. I can't wait to hear from her in just a minute. Third, we have El Paso, Texas. They made the great choice to save a whole bunch of time and work by modeling their policy on Tucson's to avoid reinventing the wheel, which is very smart. But while they were developing their policy, they took advantage of that period of time to build a really broad coalition. And they did that by creating a ton of opportunities for local news to give good coverage. They shared a lot of grassroots stories from the community. They created renderings of projects, what things could look like, and they had 1 million meetings with community members and city leaders one-on-one. From El Paso, we've got Jerry Saavedra here with us today. He's the Senior Community Policy Director at the American Heart Association. He's a local advocate who is instrumental in the Complete Streets Coalition. We're going to hear more about. Thank you, Jerry, for being here today. Lastly, yes, Michael is here. Great. Joplin, Missouri, they took advantage of funding from the state to help develop their policy. They also participated in the 2019 Complete Streets Consortium run by the National Complete Streets Coalition. And being a part of that helped them tap into a broader network of state and even national advocates and build really strong relationships with policymakers. And as you'll hear from Michael in just a minute, he's been involved in a handful of other policies around the state. He has logged the miles. I don't know, on his biking around the state, maybe a little too far for that, touching a lot of communities across the state, but having that veteran experience involved in their policy was a big boost for them. And Michael, as I mentioned, Michael Kelly, he is the policy director at Bike Walk KC, and although that has KC in the name, he is a state level advocate who assisted local practitioners with the development of the Joplin policy, in addition to, I don't know, a half dozen, 8, 10 other policies, communities around the state. He's going to talk about that just a little bit. So with that, I will take this off the screen and we will dive right in. So thank you, panelists, for being here today. Super excited to have you all here today. And I just want to pass it over to everybody and have you just introduce yourself real quick and talk about your role and your organization in the development of the policy, and maybe share just one high-level lesson that you learned through this process, something that you did not know going in that you wish you knew a couple of years ago, whether that's through developing, passing that policy or putting it into practice. And we're gonna start with Jeff Riegner, who worked in Howard County. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Steve. As Steve mentioned, I'm a senior principal with Kittleson Associates, and while I'm based in Newark, Delaware, I spent a lot of time in Howard County during the preparation of the policy and in a number of different implementation steps, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Just for reference, Howard County is a county of a little more than 300,000 people. It's located between Baltimore and Washington, and it ranges from fairly dense suburbs to very rural areas. So a lot of the more suburban context that I know people are interested in. I think the biggest lesson for us in Howard County was creating a team, a real multidisciplinary team of both internal county folks and external stakeholders who really took ownership of the policy.
That's great. All right, thanks, Jeff. And we'll move on to Everin Samnes from Tucson.
Good morning. Thank you, Steve, and thanks so much for having me here. And it's just so exciting seeing all the hellos in the chat. I really wish I could see people's faces. Anyway, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Everin. I'm with Living Streets Alliance. We're a local nonprofit organization based in Tucson, Arizona. Our mission is to advocate for a thriving Tucson by creating great streets for all of us. And our role, particularly in the Complete Streets policy development, was really sort of spearheading the policy development process in very close collaboration with the city of Tucson and a variety of other partners that we'll hopefully get to talk a little bit about today. I would say the high-level lesson, Steve, I really appreciated your emphasis on the process. That Complete Streets is an approach and a process, and it's not really the product per se. And I feel like the same thing really applies to the policy development phase. Outcomes are obviously really important. We have a policy that was adopted unanimously. It's now included among the best Complete Streets policies in the nation. So this is really rewarding and I would say humbling at the same time. And I think looking back, though, the process was just as important, or dare say maybe even more important than the outcome. Just, fostering the process that sort of really uplifts genuine collaboration and collaborative decision-making that connects perspectives and just builds off of the collective wisdom of the people who were involved in the process. I feel like looking back, this was just one of the key things that I walked away with. And I like to say that I sort of became more of a process person after being involved in the Complete Streets policy development. So, yeah.
That's great. Jerry Saavedra from El Paso.
Hey, everybody. Jerry Saavedra with the American Heart Association. I'm actually based out of San Antonio. My hometown is El Paso, so it's very special for me to be able to work on this policy in my hometown, and just a really great experience. My role with the Heart Association is working on a variety of public policy efforts to improve the health of communities. So tobacco policies, healthy eating policies, and one of those is Complete Streets, with such a big impact on helping folks become active and helping to make sure that communities are healthier. And so it was a really great experience. And I would say for me, an important lesson, and not something I just necessarily didn't know going in, but I think, and this sounds very simple, but I think it takes a lot of work and intentionality to truly accomplish, is the importance of trust. And trust is everything on these types of efforts, and it also takes time to build, which over a course of a 2-year campaign, had plenty of time to do that. But I think in terms of establishing a coalition and making sure, when we're talking about a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of national organizations, we have local organizations, a lot of times there's a work to make sure that the local organizations and local stakeholders feel that it's not just a national organization trying to come into their community and tell them what to do. At the same time, making sure that the expertise and the knowledge that national organizations like Smart Growth America bring to the table is important as well. And so I think just working together. And I think in terms of establishing the policy, that was in navigating the policymaking process. I think because we were able to do that on the coalition level, it allowed us to develop that trust with city staff and also the elected city leadership, where they saw that this was representative of what the community was working together to put together. And I think at the end of the day, helped us get to a great outcome.
Terrific. And Michael.
Hi, everyone. Michael Kelly here, Policy Director for Bike Walk KC here in Kansas City, Missouri. Have to give a shout out to all my Missouri folks. And Bike Walk KC is actually part of a statewide coalition known as Missourians for Responsible Transportation. It involves folks in Kansas City, St. Louis, Columbia, and Springfield that work with smaller communities that don't have local advocacy orgs to help them develop good planning and policy efforts, including complete streets. And that included our work in Joplin. And so in terms of what we did, we actually developed a complete streets ordinance template that we provided to Joplin to help guide their efforts to develop their policy. And then we also provided technical assistance through that and gathered additional feedback that could then be used to strengthen the policy and personalize it for the people of Joplin. I think the big lesson that I would offer for everyone who's listening today is really think about kind of the bigger picture that you want the Complete Streets policy to help create. Joplin was recovering still from a very terrible tornado from almost a decade ago that's been shaping much of its redevelopment. And it's also being influenced by a growth of population in Northwest Arkansas to its south. And so having those two elements come together really helps to inform what kind of place Joplin needs to become, and also makes it easier to paint the picture of how complete streets can fit in with that long-term vision. So excited to be here, excited to share the space with you all, and yeah, happy to talk about this further.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks, everybody. So let's dive in. It takes a lot of work to produce these policies, as you know all too well. And I'm sure we'll get some even in the questions today. We get a lot of questions about, what resources local advocates can tap to help develop these policies and pass these policies. So I'd love to hear from Everin, Michael, and Jerry about the resources that you were able to use, fundings, toolkits, technical assistance, whatever it was, that helped you through that process of building the coalition and developing a policy. We'll start with Everin.
Sure. Yeah, I honestly, it takes a village, I think, to do this kind of work, especially if you're coming from the advocacy side of things. And I would say that we were very fortunate to have access to a variety of resources. So first of all, funding. That's obviously really important, again, especially if you're coming from the nonprofit side. We had already identified that complete streets was a high priority issue through our previous advocacy efforts, but didn't necessarily have the funding to dedicate staff time to actually do the work. And then we first got connected with National Complete Streets Coalition back in 2015. And this is actually a sweet little anecdote. I was at the National Walking Summit organized by America Walks, and I went to a networking reception and ended up meeting Emiko Atherton, who was at the time the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition. And that's really how we started getting connected then to Voices for Healthy Kids, which was a joint initiative between American Heart Association and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which funded our Complete Streets work. And getting that grant was a game changer. It really increased our staff capacity to run the campaign and also gave us access to other types of technical assistance. So then through that, for example, when we kicked off the policy initiative, again, Emiko, along with Veronica Davis, came to Tucson and did a big Complete Streets policy development workshop as the public launch of the initiative. And we were also able to work with National Complete Streets Coalition throughout the policy development, just as a thought partner, reaching out with questions, asking folks to review some critical language that we were looking at incorporating in our policy. Also use the National Complete Streets Coalition's policy development framework, obviously was a really great guide and really helped us think through the different aspects we wanted to make sure we wanted to include in the policy language. Again, through this Voices for Healthy Kids grant, we were able to bring in a spokesperson training into town. And then we were able to get a legal counsel, which I cannot recommend enough, especially if you're coming from the nonprofit side of things, because there's issues around like lobbying and whatnot. So yeah, I would just say, big shout out to all these individuals and organizations that really invested in our organizational capacity. I just have nothing but gratitude. And just thinking about that one networking session, I was like, if there was one networking session I could go in my life, I feel like I really lucked out on that one. So
the rare networking session that actually turned into like something really, really productive. That's great to hear. I would also plug Veronica Davis has a terrific book that is either out or coming out very soon called Inclusive Transportation. Everyone should go check that out and grab it for sure. Michael, what were the resources you tapped in Joplin and even more broadly, even across the state in your work?
Yeah, so I think the big thing is that Missouri was chosen for the consortium series, and so it involved Eastern Jackson County, which is basically Kansas City, Joplin, and Kirksville, which is outside of St. Louis. And so being able to participate in that not only gave us access to additional resources, but really having the opportunity to work closely with Smart Growth America to understand the ins and outs, nuts and bolts of policy development. That came in really handy in terms of the resource that we developed, the Complete Streets Ordinance template, because what we basically did is we said, okay, we want an ideal policy because we know that communities want to be able to adopt effective policies. And so we sat down and we wrote it out based on the policy guidelines from Smart Growth America, and then asked Smart Growth America to grade it. And we went through several rounds of this and ultimately developed a template that scored a perfect score. And so the idea is if a community takes this and more or less mimics what's written in the policy, they will get a perfect score. They will develop a strong policy. We know that that also has to be coupled with personalizing it so that it can address specific nuances in various communities. And so one of the big things that we developed with a template that is somewhat Missouri specific, at least as far as we know, is many of the communities that we have worked with are adjacent to Amish or Mennonite communities. And so there's a large concentration of folks who rely on horse-drawn carriages as their form of transportation. They don't drive cars, and some of them do bike, but they often rely on horse-drawn carriages. And so writing that language explicitly into policies is part of how we make those things unique and work more effectively for those communities. And so I think all that's to say that in terms of the resources, the greatest resource will remain the people that you're working alongside. And so it's really important to develop a coalition that truly reflects the various nuances and needs of the community that that policy is trying to serve.
Yeah, that's terrific. Let's go to Jerry. Hey, how did you in El Paso? What sort of resources were you able to cobble together and tap for your effort?
Yeah, I would say in El Paso, we were lucky because the American Heart Association actually got a REACH grant from the CDC, which was very helpful in allowing us to really invest in bringing on board a local engineering firm, Quantum Engineering. And again, as you mentioned earlier, Steve, when we first got started, we were looking at what are the best policies that currently exist in Tucson. I think I just passed and was a great example. But we wanted to make sure that the policy wasn't just Tucson's policy, it needed to be El Paso's policy. And so being able to get some resources to bring on board a local engineering firm that the staff from that firm had a lot of folks that previously worked for the city that knew the way that the city transportation department and all of that process worked. They were able to look to see what Tucson did. We also looked at some other cities as well, and then customized it to fit El Paso. It also was very important to spend some of those resources looking to see what the city had already done. As you mentioned, a lot of cities have passed what they think is a complete streets policy, but is may not be what we're looking at in terms of a complete streets policy. It's not binding, or some of the stuff is just recommendations. And so looking to see, or they just don't call it complete streets. They may call it something else, but in all intents and purposes, it's a complete streets policy. So I think what was important to learn early on was that the city wanted to go in this direction. A lot of the strategic plan El Paso, a lot of other, the bike plan and other things were being developed. They were currently updating other transportation related plans that would be within what we want the Complete Streets policy to include. And so it was important for us to get an accounting of what's currently going on, what are the things that the city is currently working on, and having folks who know and have those relationships to be able to navigate all that, and then to translate that into a policy that works and fits and meets the needs of the community was really important. I also think that it's important for a technical assistance from the national perspective of folks like Smart Growth America, Safe Routes Partnership. We were able to take what the local firm developed for El Paso, but then have other folks look at it and say, hey, well, have you thought about including this aspect or this element? Making sure we're adding things like equity considerations and implementation and a lot of the new elements, Steve, that you had mentioned earlier. And so I think through that REACH grant, there was another expert, Mark Fenton, who was really helpful in how we message and talk about this and answer the cost questions and a lot of the common challenges that sometimes get raised. So those are great resources to be able to train the local folks and being able to talk about Complete Streets in a way that wasn't super technical, but just brought it back to the needs of the community of improving the health and safety and the needs of El Paso. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, Michael was talking about the template and a roadmap to getting a good score for a policy. And that's great. It's a great place to start, but none of these policies, even a high scoring one, will really make an impact without a coalition of support. How do you build that coalition? How do you get the people together that sort of span, all the sectors, public, private, local, nonprofits, everything? How do you get that coalition together? Who was involved in your process? Why were they critical? And how did you get all these various people that may be interested in all sorts of different subjects and topics and transportation or, health or whatever it is, working together? How were you able to do that? We're going to go right back to Jerry and hear a little bit about, I'd love to hear you talk about the coalition. We're going to show a visual on the screen of how broad your coalition was, but how did you get that together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it took a while. And I think in any community, there's already going to be stakeholders who are working in some way or form on this policy. And so, rather than starting from scratch or just starting your own coalition, one of our key partners, Action for Healthy Kids, had a coalition that was focused more on safe routes to schools. And so that was one of our first conversations to say, hey, we want to help focus an effort specifically on updating the Complete Streets policy for El Paso. We don't want to recreate the wheel, so how can we work together on that? And so we ended up coming up with the El Paso Complete Streets Coalition, kind of the umbrella organization that then we can all go underneath, and then recruiting additional folks from all over the different stakeholders of the city. Myself, I had never worked on a Complete Streets policy before this one. And so when it came to, knowing the ins and outs of the technical part of it, had no clue on that. But luckily we had the right people that did know all of that. And when it came to the different aspects, I just kind of want to talk a little bit. So when talking about safety, Action for Healthy Kids, there was a big focus. A young girl had just gotten hit by a car and died walking to school. And so that was really in the news at the time when we were first kicking that off. A big focus on how do we help folks walking from the neighborhoods to the schools, our parks, and safety. Also Farm City and some other local El Paso on that front of safety. The other big part of it, as we mentioned earlier, was health. And so, groups like the Heart Association, Diabetes Association, and then locally, Center for Community Health Impact, Paso del Norte Health Foundation, Texas Tech Health Science Center, they're really focused on, and this is, right before the pandemic hit. So even when the pandemic hit and folks were stuck in their homes, an extra emphasis on how do we get out and get physically active and not just be sitting on the couch all day watching Netflix. So that became another big thing on our messaging, was really the improving street safety and also improving the health of the community were the two main rationales. But then you talk about kids in schools, again, we're bringing in the school district, El Paso Independent School District, the YMCA. We're talking about older adults. AARP was a huge supporter, huge stakeholder that's important. Locally, the Rio Grande area on aging, the disability community, Volad Center for Independent Living was a tremendous supporter. And again, locally, they're the voice of the disability community. So they really carried a lot of weight. And we took advantage of an opportunity around the anniversary of the Americans the ADA, the Disability Act, and the Joey Acosta did a great op-ed making the connection between, achieving the promise of the ADA by updating the Complete Streets policy. And so everything we did was bringing it back to our ultimate goal, which is updating that policy. And then also the environmental community. I think people don't necessarily think of the environmental community when we're talking about Complete Streets, but El Paso and the climate, another good reason why Tucson was a great example is that dry climate, wanting to make sure that street trees, things like that, that are part of, if you create opportunities for people to be more active, where there's a little bit of shade or opportunities to not just be in the hot sun the whole time, then it's going to create those incentives. So a lot of different voices beyond just what I think in traditional, when you say Complete Streets, people just think bike lanes. You're just talking about folks that ride bikes that are, and actually one of our partners who's on this webinar, I believe, would remind us is that even when you say biking, people just think of folks in spandex who are like, working all hard, but they don't think about the little kid that's just riding their bike to school, or folks that are just recreational. And so there's just so many different voices. And again, folks that live in the places that historically in El Paso had not been invested in and where the infrastructure lacked, I think was another big key of making sure it was an equitable policy.
Yeah, so important to have those people at the table to get that perspective. Everin, talk a little bit about the task force and sort of you became a process person, you said. What was that process like of assembling that coalition in Tucson?
Sure. First of all, I'm honored, Jerry, to hear that you and the coalition at El Paso used our policy as sort of a model to look at and then adopted. That's just really, it's rewarding to hear. And I think one of the biggest reasons why the policy was a strong policy that other folks could look at is that diverse group of partners that came to the table with the Complete Streets Task Force. But before the task force, we really started out with an even smaller group, which we just called the Brain Trust, and met with this group really for the first 6 months before we even did anything with the broader public. And those initial conversations were really about sort of like setting us on the right path, if you will. And a lot of it was focused on how to build the policy upon a strong equity framework, things we needed to pay attention to. So that small group then evolved and expanded into the Complete Streets Task Force, which at that point was a body of people that included various staff from a variety of city departments, but then also non-governmental organizations representing different issue areas like affordable housing, green infrastructure, food justice, disability rights, public health, because, Complete Streets is not just about transportation. So we wanted to make sure that all these perspectives were embodied in the task force that we were able to bring together. And honestly, Steve, I can talk about the task force for hours, but I know we don't have hours. Yeah. So in a nutshell, it was about really modeling a different process for policy development that was grounded in collaborative decision-making. And meetings were designed and facilitated in a way to sort of foster this engaging environment and invite everyone's participation on even footing, whether they knew about policy, technical issues around transportation or not at all, just sort of like have that basically everyone be able to participate and bring their own expertise and experience and knowledge into the work. A lot of focus on relationship building. Meetings were facilitated using these sort of strengths-based facilitation methods like appreciative inquiry. It was also about bringing accountability to the process. It was very iterative. So we would basically take what we were hearing from the task force and then also from the community engagement process that was happening in tandem, and then just sort of bring it into the drafts, bring it back to the task force, have these conversations, have another draft, bring it back. So it worked very iteratively. The task force really gave its blessing to the final policy before it was presented to the Tucson Mayor and Council. And again, big shout out here to everyone who participated, and then also the amazing facilitators and collaborative process designers, really the two people that we work with. They're Bryn Jones of Elan Consulting and Sarah Griffiths of the Next Chapter Consulting and Coaching. They really enriched worked tremendously along with everyone who participated. And I should just also mention, there's also the community engagement side of things. I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but just the community dialogues and the pop-up engagement all focused on meeting people where they are, just sort of going a little bit outside of the traditional ways of engaging with the community that we had seen up until that time. And again, I mean, I don't want to represent it in a way that we reached every group that we wanted, whose voices we wanted to be amplified. But I think there were some groups that we were able to bring into the mix. One example I'll share was the third graders from the Arizona School for the Deaf and Blind. And when one of our we worked with a bunch of partners who were facilitating these community dialogues with their own communities. They participated in a training, and then they were reaching out to their own communities to host these dialogues. And a teacher who's at that school, a mobility orientation specialist, worked with the class of third graders. And, we heard things like, we would like candy stores at each bus stop, which didn't make it into the policy. But really, I think hearing from these different groups and with different kinds of needs and priorities, for example, in that case, it really elevated accessibility issues and the way we included that language in the policy. So again, I think the partnership with the community and just making an effort to reach out to groups and populations and communities that are traditionally left out of these types of processes and planning and policy decisions were critical. And just seeing that now the city of Tucson is doing a lot more of these sorts of things, like the tiny little community ambassador model we piloted, I guess. It's being included in a lot of the other city initiatives. So it's just kind of gratifying to see that that's the new direction for community engagement. And lastly, our city partners, right? So city staff were part of the task force, but then we were also working very, very closely with a smaller group of people at the transportation department. They were really our thought partners moving the policy along. And then we were also blessed to have the policymakers, like our mayor at the time who championed the policy, our current mayor Romero, who was at the time a city council member, and additional city council members. And so again, bringing them into the mix, meeting with them regularly, even though we started at a good place of support, still updating them about how the process was going. So it was just like a multitude of partnerships and collaborations, I think, that made the process more valuable and led to a more robust policy. That's
great. Well, the big part of these policies is once they're passed is how are they implemented? This was our big change a few years ago, was even the strongest policy, if it doesn't affect what gets built and where, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. How does it get implemented? So that's what I want to talk about here is, and finally we'll get to hear from Jeff here, who's been waiting patiently, because I would love to talk about especially the design manual that you produced. That's one, it's covered in our framework as an important element of a strong policy, producing that design manual. But you guys had the policy and design manual almost at the same time. So I'd love to hear about the progress that you have made in Howard County on implementation, and also just touch on that design guide a little bit.
Sure thing, Steve. It didn't take much patience because it was great hearing everything that Everin and Michael and Jerry had to say. But you're right. Implementation is really where a policy turns into reality. And, my role was really facilitating a pretty amazing team. As Everin said, it takes a village. So we created a Complete Streets implementation team in the county, which was an equal number of county staff and other folks, including the Horizon Foundation, the Multimodal Transportation Board, a county council member served on it. And we also had county staff from the Office of Transportation, DPW, Planning and Zoning, the administration. And that was the main step, I think, that made the design manual work well. This was not a token effort. Participants really actively proposed and debated ideas. We did need to build trust because our participants ranged from strong advocates to real skeptics of the whole idea of complete streets. So getting everyone on the same page was really critical to advance implementation. There's a pretty thorough inclusion of policy elements in each of the documents. And in fact, some members of the Complete Streets implementation team actually even wrote sections of the key documents. So it was really important. But the design manual, it's critically important to document the key principles of the Complete Streets policy in a document that's used by everyone that has a hand in planning and engineering street improvements. This isn't a suburban community. This is not a truly urban place in most of its areas. So getting the design right is really critical. It applies to both capital projects and developer projects, because developers build maybe 2/3 or so of all the improvements to the county's transportation network. So it's really critical to include them as well. It was a big effort. I think, Jerry talked about the size of the effort being a big deal. This was a 350-page design manual. And there were some pretty spirited discussions that you would expect from a group that represents these kind of diverse interests. Just a couple specifics. It included a project prioritization process so that we made sure that projects were prioritized for a variety of things: multimodal safety and access, equity. We wanted to make sure that we provided a disproportionate share of funds to those communities that had experienced disinvestment or underinvestment in the past, crash history, system preservation, and also opportunities to leverage funding from non-county sources. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we incorporated a community engagement plan that was very highly equity focused and included a citizens guide for involvement.
Mm-hmm. That's terrific. Yeah, everybody, we put the link to the design manual in the chat if anybody wants to look at that, and be great to use as a model and inspiration. Everin, tell us about, implementation is also about, this is a separate element, but project selection. A good, strong policy actually influences the process by which projects are chosen. What does that look like in Tucson, and how is your policy shaping the project selection process?
Sure, Steve. Just a few steps I want to highlight before we get to project selection, because it's, I think, all linked to one another when it comes to implementation. So out of the things that the policy identified as implementation steps, some move forward very quickly, like hiring of the project manager, the Complete Streets program manager, the Complete Streets Coordinating Council, which is the public body that oversees and brings accountability. And there's like fabulous people doing great work there. So big shout out to them as well for their dedication. And then the design guidelines, the Complete Streets design guidelines were adopted. And meanwhile, also Move Tucson, the transportation master plan, which was also identified in the policy, was developed. So that's where the project prioritization really comes in, because Move Tucson identified a list of projects, but then prioritizing them it required some metrics. And so while doing that work, one of the key influences of the policy was to elevate equity-focused prioritization criteria, so that projects located in parts of town where there's like a higher concentration of mobility vulnerable populations would actually score higher, would have a multiplier associated with that. So again, I think hearing from folks working on it, that having that sort of language embedded in the policy was really helpful in terms of putting it in place when it comes to creating these subsequent documents like or tools like the prioritization tool. And that said, there's still a lot of work to be done. I just want to be really cautious about not painting an overly rosy picture, because we also have, like you mentioned, increasing number of very tragic fatalities in Tucson. And so we haven't yet seen the results of the policy in the ground, like in terms of projects, because things do take time, but that's about to change, because now we have a funding source that will fund some projects that sort of embody the Complete Streets approach. So can't get there soon enough. But meanwhile, yeah, there's definitely been some implementation steps that moved very quickly.
Great. Well, we're going to move to some of the questions we've had coming in the Q&A, and I'm going to actually close with the section on advice from you all. So y'all can be thinking about that as we go through these questions. What, one short little bit of advice. We'll close with that and let you guys have the final word. Some of the questions that we've had coming in. This first one I want to ask to Michael. What was the role of any of the MPOs, the metropolitan planning organizations, in Missouri or in any of the regions you worked in developing the policy?
Sure. So with Joplin specifically, they have a smaller version of an MPO. It's known as a Regional Planning Commission, or RPC. And so that is actually organized kind of within Joplin's kind of city. So it's kind of a weird element. The thing that was helpful with that was the same person who basically organized that was also one of the transportation planners and the big internal champions. Her name's Taylor Cunningham. And so that was helpful to kind of have that regional approach, to bring in that regional expertise and say, this is the approach we should be taking. In other communities that we worked in, like closer to home here in Kansas City, we have a really good relationship with the Mid-America Regional Council, our MPO here. They have actually developed a regional complete streets policy that we're in the process of trying to help them update. And so having that kind of institutional backing that says, yes, complete streets are important, municipalities should have complete streets, is really effective for getting municipalities to actually take those steps to develop and adopt their own policies.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And coordination is so important there. The elephant in the room when we talk about pedestrian fatalities is how central state-owned roads are to those. And, so many of these policies are very local. They may shape local streets. State DOTs, state policies have started to be a part of this conversation. Some states have context classification guides. Florida has done some of this with some success to recognize that state roads running through a city, through an urban area, an area with lots of development, a lot of people, needs a different label than arterial or connector. Someone asked about hearing the perspective of anybody who's worked with a community that has a local policy and how that conversation, how you have interfaced with the state. And maybe I'll throw this one to Jeff, because I know you've talked to the SHA in Maryland. What is that? I mean, a lot of the biggest, busiest roads through Howard County are going to be Maryland-owned roads. How are you interfacing with the state and with this county level policy, and what does that look like? Because this is really the nut we have to crack if we want to move these fatalities in the other direction, right? These are the roads that are the most dangerous.
Sure. Yeah, the policy specifically noted the need for coordination with the Maryland State Highway Administration on any projects, but Howard County is somewhat spoiled in that the state of Maryland has a program that's called Context Driven that, like you're saying, is very strongly devoted to creating streets that are more appropriate for their contexts. I mentioned briefly earlier, Howard County is very much a suburban context. Columbia, Maryland was one of the main planned communities in the U.S. when it was built starting in the 60s. We have a lot of legacy roads in Howard County to deal with. So a lot of projects are retrofit rather than building new. And certainly the state is an active part in discussions of any of those types of improvements. But we're very lucky to have that type of framework within which we can work.
That's terrific. We're also, I think we noted this in the chat earlier, we have some resources about state level policies and some profiles of state level policies coming out. Everybody stay tuned for some of those. Jerry, we talked about your coalition, 20 organizations. That's a huge roster. What was everybody's contribution to the coalition? Someone asked if you could speak a bit more to the time, talent, donations, money that coalition members provided.
Yeah, I mean, I think with a diverse coalition, it's going to, diverse amount of responsibilities and roles. And, sometimes you just need folks to join a monthly call, lend their name to a letter of support or make some emails. Other times it's more intensive, and other folks that are, have more time and are more invested. So I would say there's not, it was a variety of things. I think what we did is had a monthly call where at least once a month we all got together and talked through the various aspects of the campaign. And then at that time, if there was any specific needs or anything, throw that out to the coalition and ask the appropriate folks to weigh in. But didn't want to waste everyone's time. Over a 2-year campaign, I think the other big challenge was keeping folks engaged and making sure that, it's like, well, when is this going to happen or not? And so part of that is just kind of managing also expectations, timeline, being transparent, and making sure that if you're going to have folks join a call, that you make it worth their time and not just doing a bunch of report outs and things that they could have done via email.
Yeah, meetings that could have been an email. It's a popular topic. Maybe I'll toss this one out to all four, because this is so important with implementation, is holding jurisdictions accountable once these policies are on the books. Anybody who has seen that happen, how have you held your jurisdictions accountable? Has anyone sued a city to uphold a complete streets policy? If they've had to, how have you handled holding a jurisdiction accountable? I'll just toss that out to anybody who wants to jump in.
So this isn't necessarily Joplin specific. This is more Kansas City specific. I think that the thing is that you have to constantly work to cultivate the champion. So it's a matter of elevating the folks who you know are going to be champions and will carry this forward, so you don't have to do that. But the other part of it is very clearly demonstrating what the cost is for not implementing these policies. We often get hit with these questions of, well, if I pay all this money, then that's money that I'm not going to have for some other curb or parking improvement. And we oftentimes try to flip it and say, look, the cost of you not doing this is someone is injured or someone's in a ward. And sometimes you have to be that frank, because transportation is dangerous by design, as Smart Growth America has said. And so it sometimes involves being diplomatic, but the diplomacy stops at the point where you have to be an advocate and you have to advocate for the people who need those complete streets. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken. But we try to avoid the browbeating as much as possible.
Okay, well, I think we're going to have to end it there. And actually, I think with the advice, I think this is what will lead off a follow-up email or blog post with everybody, is just one quick sentence of your best advice. So stay tuned for that. I think if you signed up for the webinar, you should get that. I want to say an enormous thank you to Jeff, Michael, Jerry, and Everin for being here today. This is a terrific conversation. I wish we could go just a little longer. So thank you so much. And congratulations to all of you for the work that you've done. It's tremendous. It's a wonderful example to hold up to others. I hope everyone here will find some inspiration and draw from this work that's been done, and realize you don't have to start at square one. Just a couple quick notes. We'll have a recording of this up soon, and hopefully we're going to tackle some of the questions that we didn't ask today, didn't get asked today in a post. Just want to remind everybody, the full policy inventory is online. That has new and updated policies in it. You can find all the information. There's a link to it in the Best Complete Streets policy page. I think right now it's under the table of full scores. There's a link. You can see it takes you off to a spreadsheet that's got much more information. Don't sleep on the new Complete Streets framework. We love those graphics. We think it looks great. And as you heard today, it's a great place to start with a new policy. We have a lot of other things coming out this year as well. So sign up for the Complete Streets email list if you are not already on it. Again, a wonderful thank you to our speakers today. This is a reflection of the fact that the National Complete Streets Coalition is truly national. It is a coalition effort. You can see that through these stories we heard today. So thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you, everybody, for participating and asking great questions. And we will see you all soon. Thanks so much.